I have the pleasure of introducing Cristina Richie, PhD, who's a lecturer in the Philosophy and Ethics of Technology department at the Delft University of Technology, and was a School of Social and Political Science Research Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities, University of Edinburgh in 2020. In 2021, she was endorsed by the British Academy for a UK Global Talent Visa. She was previously an assistant professor in the Bioethics and Interdisciplinary Studies Department at the Brody School of Medicine, East Carolina University. Her research is dedicated to just, sustainable healthcare, which is evident from her talk today, which she'll introduce, in addition to her monographs, Principles of Green Bioethics, Sustainability in Healthcare. She's also author of over 50 articles in journals, including The Lancet, American Journal of Bioethics, the Journal of Medical Ethics, and the Hastings Center Report. She's a current head of the Netherlands Unit Rotterdam, as well as the UNISEC co-chair in bioethics, and holds a nominated fellowship at the Center of Bioethics and Human Dignity at Trinity University. So I'll hand over to Cristina in order for her to introduce this talk, and then we'll have some questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comfort, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, Phil, for allowing me to give this talk. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and the slides will be made available to you afterwards. And I will just get into the talk. If you have questions, you can pop them through the chat, but please, I'd like to hold it to the discussion for after. And I'm looking forward to engaging with you on this very important topic. So green bioethics. Green bioethics is essentially a methodological framework that I developed and was published in 2019 on my first monograph. And it comes from environmental bioethics. So what this is, it's the intersection of medical ethics and environmental ethics. And as I assume most of you are medical ethicists, since this is the IME, I'm going to give just a brief background of environmental ethics to situate it. So this is really environmental ethics going over to biomedical ethics. You can also do the other way, biomedical ethics going over to environmental ethics. That's usually more like public health. And green bioethics is synthesizing the two. So just a background on this, environmental ethics, as you're probably well aware from the climate crisis and from decades of living in a more socially aware society, there is a problem on our hands in that we are said to be living in the era of the Anthropocene. So this is such that now humans are actually affecting the way not only climate affects biosystems and others, but also the land through industrialization, through intensive agriculture, through mobility. And so we are shaping the global landscape and evolution of our planet through our own volition. This isn't necessarily bad. It could be good, but we're doing it in a way that is harmful. So this is characterized by two interconnected and interdependent challenges. One is human population growth, and one is resource consumption measured in carbon emissions. That's a handy metric. It's not all inclusive. There's a lot of problems with it, but it is sort of the currency that we talk about now is carbon emissions. So of these two things, of environmental ethics, first we see that the world population has exploded. It's doubled in my lifetime, and probably therefore in yours too. And what we see with this is that, of course, more people can live well or less well. In the industrialized world, we use a lot of resources. So it's not that the numbers are inherently problematic. They only become problematic when the earth can't provide for all of these people in a way that's just and adequate. So what we see is that not everyone lives well. There's huge gaps in access to food, water, housing. And in addition to this, that some people need way more resources, we're already using the equivalent of 2 or more Earths per year. Every year around June or July, there's an Earth Used Recognition Day, and it'll tell you the day that we've already gone through the annual resources of our Earth. And it falls in the summer, so it'll be coming up. And what this means is that we as a human society are using too many resources of the earth. So it's not sustainable. The earth can't replenish it. And at the same time, it's not distributed in a just manner. So this is an issue for multiple reasons. Again, population wouldn't be a concern in itself if everyone was living at a different level. So we could all be living in, we could all be camping, essentially. I just came back from 4 days camping in Mull on the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. And if we were all picking our berries and sleeping in a tent and used water from a stream, that would be sustainable for all 8, 9, 10 billion of us. But we don't live that way. We most of the time, we live in houses with electricity and running water and food and big agriculture and fast fashion, et cetera. Human population growth is expected to explode. So even if, according to the proceedings for the National Academy of Science, we were to do something about this from a policy perspective, still population would keep on expanding because of basically the way reproduction rates work and the way people, the way we reproduce geometrically instead of arithmetically. In terms of policy, people get really concerned when we start talking about policy and reproduction, but there's a number of ways that we as a society can have just ethical policies that would reduce population and irrespective of the environmental impact and have doubled evidence of benefits for people. So we know that there's a gap in desirability and access to contraception in many parts of the world, with parts of sub-Saharan Africa having gaps of up to 8 to 13% of women not being able to access contraception. And not only is that a justice issue, that's a medical issue. Women die from being pregnant. They die of maternal mortality and morbidity. So contraception is a basic healthcare need. So if a policy, for instance, closed these gaps in access to contraception, human population growth would reduce. Ethically, it'd be better for women who don't die. It'd be better for the planet. A second way that policy could be enacted would be to align with the Sustainable Development Goal of bridging the gap in educational access of young women and girls. So we know that the more education a woman has in general is correlated to her having fewer children for a few different reasons. One is that she's in school, so she just simply doesn't have the time to have kids. 2 is that more education gives her more opportunities to choose her own path and decide if and how she wants to be a parent and what that would look like. And 3, it also allows women to have a stake in important social structures like economics, like workforce, like politics, because they can then have the education to participate in those structures, but also have the freedom from heteronormative sexist impositions of child-rearing responsibilities. So educating women is a second policy that we could have to reduce population growth. Be better for the planet too. And a third, of course, would be, in addition to bridging contraceptive access, making things like abortion safe, legal, and accessible, if rare, ensuring that women who want contraceptive sterilization have access to it instead of discriminating against child-free women who request that. I wrote about that in 2013 in the Hastings Center report, and ensuring that other countries maintain openness of reproductive rights and access for women. So that would reduce population in a way, in a third policy way that would be completely ethical, aligned with well-established goals and objectives of society, and not have to get into the muddy territory of enforcing a smaller family, such as, or having penalties for it, as in China's one-child policy. Okay, more bad news of environmental ethics, resource consumption. So we have population growth, and then we have resources, and that's what we need. We all need resources. We're humans, we need food, shelter, clothing, anything that would fall along the lines of Martha Nussbaum's capabilities. Those are material goods, a lot of them are, that we need. And so what the environmental movement has done is it's quantified this and not just said resource consumption, but it's translated it to carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. And many things emit greenhouse gases naturally. For instance, cows emit methane. And again, it's not harmful, but it becomes harmful when there's too much of it. So scientists have calculated that we're over the 350 parts per million of safe amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And this is affecting human health. It's affecting biodiversity. and animals and plants in the ecosystem that sustains us. So the metric of carbon dioxide, you're probably familiar with. Everything has it. This lecture has it. You have one, I have one. My glass of water has a carbon footprint. And carbon footprints vary incredibly depending on the country you're in. So worldwide, the America and China have the top two highest carbon footprints as nations. However, Americans have one of the highest carbon footprints because there's fewer Americans than there are Chinese. So when you do the average, it's enormous for an American. So one of the things you can do that will change your carbon footprint is actually relocating. As an American, it was quite liberating for me to come to the UK and the Netherlands and have my carbon footprint dropped simply just because I was in a more sustainable infrastructure. So why this is, in America, for instance, there's a lot of decentralized transportation, which means reliance on fossil fuels. There's overconsumption of a lot of macronutrients, so high rates of obesity, which means that there's bigger dependence on big agriculture. There is the economics that goes on and production of things, and then everything else that's in the system, of all the people, the packaging, the lighting, the heating, et cetera. So what this means is a few things. Ethically, this doesn't tell us, although it tells us per capita, it doesn't tell us who's actually using the resources. So you see, we have in there the footprint of a homeless person. It's still very high, but that's just the average. They're not actually benefiting from the economic resources that the United States has, and they're being harmed by the carbon emissions that the United States is exporting. So this doesn't tell us if the per capita emissions are being allocated fairly. It also doesn't tell us what they're being allocated on. Some of the things Henry Shue would call luxury emissions rather than subsistence emissions. So we all need clothing, but we don't need 10 t-shirts. You can only wear one at a time. It's nice to have a second one though, when you're doing laundry, to put something on. So this is the kind of thing, luxury versus subsistence, we can also think about. Again, highlighting that the top two environmentally intensive countries are China and the United States, with the third being all of the EU 28 when the UK was in there. And what this means is that it's very good if you live in a country that's more sustainable, that cares about sustainability, has signed on to legally binding measures or endorses something non-legally binding. But if China and the US don't reduce their carbon footprint, it's not going to matter in terms of environmental destruction. And it's certainly not going to matter in terms of benefiting the world because of climate change health hazards. So carbon emissions don't stay within national borders. They get exported around the world and they increase climate change issues like pollution, asthma, hurricanes, deaths by thermal extremes. And these get put into other parts of the world where, first of all, they may not have access to medical care. Second of all, they are disproportionately disadvantaged, that they may not have the economic, political, or social resources to move from an area that's been affected by a climate disaster. And third, they don't have the economic benefits of the emissions. So at least if a country is producing emissions, there might be some trade-off in terms of people can get rich from it. Some people can. So this highlights that climate change in all areas and climate resource reduction has to be an issue that other nations push China and the US on. Otherwise, it won't matter for us as a society. So the intersection here between healthcare and environmental ethics are twofold. One is the carbon of healthcare. So as I said, you, me, the lecture, the glass of water has a carbon footprint, so does healthcare. The second thing is climate change health hazards. And so the first one has been a focus of environmental bioethics, green bioethics in my work. The second one has been more a focus of public health ethics. Both have a tradition of at least 30 years. Globally, the carbon footprint of a country's healthcare industry varies. Of the research that was done by Pitchler et al. In 2019, here we see a range from about 4% to 8%. The Netherlands is the one that has the highest healthcare carbon of its country's carbon footprint. but not the highest number overall. So in the first column, we have the country. In the second column, we have the million tons of carbon that the healthcare industry in that country produces annually, what it is per capita, so what the average resident uses in terms of healthcare carbon, and then the share of the country's healthcare carbon for what it is as the nation. These numbers are not normatively significant unless we can interpret them in some ways. So the first thing that I would call your attention to is in the country's million tons of carbon emissions, you'll see China and the US have the top two highest, which makes sense because the nations have the highest carbon footprint. Therefore, you would assume that their healthcare system has the highest carbon footprints as well. But when you look at per capita, for China, it's 0.44, and for the US, it's 1.5. So again, the per capita doesn't tell us who's using it, who's accessing it. It's just a number divided by another number. We know that there's gaps in healthcare access, even in the industrialized world, for reasons because of, for instance, in the United States, a lot of African Americans have mistrust in the healthcare system. So they find barriers either of their own or of provider bias. We know that LGBT people and the undocumented face barriers because of discrimination, fear of legal repercussions, or living in areas that don't have access to healthcare. So one of the issues here is that we have healthcare carbon, but not everyone gets it. And again, just like resources, we need healthcare. So we're going to have to expend some healthcare carbon. We need to do it in a way, I would argue, that's just and sustainable. The way to do that, though, is not to just say everyone gets more healthcare. So it's not true that the more healthcare carbon you expend, the better your healthcare outcomes. If you look at the per capita of Canada and USA, so both in North America, you see that Americans use almost twice as much healthcare carbon per capita as the Canadians. But Americans have much worse healthcare outcomes, measured in quantifiable things like DALYs, disability adjusted life years, QALYs, quality adjusted life years, communicable diseases, mental health burdens, death by gunshot wounds, these sorts of things. So it's not just simply that we need to throw more healthcare carbon at people. It's rather that we need to look at how are we using healthcare carbon? Is it in a way that maximizes clinical benefit? Is it in a way that is conducive to preventive health? Because if you don't use the healthcare industry, you don't have a carbon footprint. Of course, you want to be not using the healthcare industry for a good reason, because you're healthy, not because you've been excluded from it. So what we have is essentially a zero-sum game in terms of carbon. We're over the 350 parts per million. Some people need much more healthcare carbon to live well. Some people are using too much. So we can't just simply say everyone gets more, because then we'll explode the healthcare carbon, just like we'd explode any other carbon. We need to look rather at where can we essentially reallocate healthcare carbon so that everyone has basic healthcare needs met. And sometimes, if we're lucky, even healthcare wants met. So that's sort of the task of what I have been looking at. And one of the ways I've been looking at it is, where can healthcare carbon be ethically reduced, and where will it be maximized? In the UK, of course, the NHS, the National Health Services, has legally binding carbon reduction measures. So this comes from 2008. The UK Climate Change Act led NHS England in 2009 to publish a document on saving carbon and being more sustainable. Later, Scotland followed, and North Ireland has their different system. Wales also has this sort of NHS. And so what they've been doing is they've been tracking, where does carbon come from? And therefore, we can look at where was it best reduced. So what we see is the most recent data on NHS is that carbon comes from medical instruments and equipment, and then pharmaceuticals. So what's already been looked at by the NHS is how to green healthcare buildings, like healthcare institutionally. That this is no different than how you would green your university or your coffee shop or a hotel. So you'd look at sustainable water, you'd look at the energy being used, the food being served inside. And that's not really what bioethics cares about. Doctors don't care about the facilities, they care about their patients. Healthcare delivery, therefore, needs to be the focus. And in fact, healthcare delivery exceeds the carbon of healthcare buildings. So physician and clinical services and pharmaceuticals are actually the two most carbon intensive parts of healthcare. So buildings have been looked at, it's great. We can move on to healthcare delivery. This is the crux of biomedical ethics, and this is where I want to focus. So we have pharmaceuticals. We see that comparatively in other parts of the world, pharmaceuticals are incredibly carbon intense too. So data from the US confirms this. That's a different talk, or you can just read the articles that I've published on it or other articles. But there's a variety of reasons why pharmaceuticals and prescription drugs are really carbon intensive, or we can talk about it in the discussion. But I just want to put that out there. So environmental bioethics looks at the carbon, the resource use of the healthcare industry, and then public health ethics have looked at climate change and healthcare. So this is how climate change causes health problems. The World Health Organization notes that this includes thermal extremes, colder winters, hotter summers, weather disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, vector-borne diseases, food and water infection. So for instance, in the Netherlands, because it's a low-lying country, heavy rains make the canals flood, which makes the crops flood, which causes them to get moldy. If you eat that, you get sick. If you don't eat it, then it's wasted food. Photochemical air pollutants cause asthma, and conflict over depleted natural resources. So now we're seeing that war is also an effect of climate change health hazards. If there's only one well in a village, there's going to be territorial conflicts over who has access to the water supply. Additionally, mental health and well-being is affected by climate change health hazards. And COVID was really a case study for this. So the climate anxiety is not just simply that you're sad that the trees are disappearing and that you're oversensitive. The mental health aspects are really similar to if you were ever told that there was going to be a lockdown and you needed to stay inside of your house. Very similar to noting that the atmospheric pollutants are so intense that you're at danger for damage to your lungs. So getting an alert on some places of China, it's like this. Don't go outside, the air quality is too bad. Don't go outside, we're having another lockdown. It's stressful. You don't know what you're going to do. You don't know how long it's going to last. You know that it could happen, but you can't really prepare for it. This is a climate anxiety that's real and has long-term effects on stress levels, just as the pandemic did for all of us. Climate change health hazards exist in every country, but the contours of them are a little bit different depending on your geographical location. So in the UK, there's a few different components. It's an island, right? But it's not super low lying. So these are the constellation of climate change health hazards that the UK is facing. So all the bad news at once, too many people causing too much carbon. We could have more people living less well, wild camping, or we could have fewer people living well. But what we have is a big number of people living with too many resources and an even bigger number of people living with not enough. These carbon emissions increase climate change health hazards. Where the medical industry comes in is that the medical industry also has carbon emissions, and caring for those affected by climate change health hazards contributes to the carbon emissions of healthcare, which therefore in turn makes more climate change health hazards and more treatments and more pollution, in addition to caring for everyone else, and overlaid with remembering some people who are affected by climate change health hazards can't even access medical care. So essentially what we can do as educators, as academics, as even public intellectuals, is we can engage with the environmental problems of healthcare in 3 different areas. We can look at biomedical ethics, talk to healthcare providers, medical students in a very classical way, using the principled approach of Beecham and Childress. We can talk about environmental bioethics and look at essentially healthcare structures and resources and those metrics, or we can look at, and actually I think these are non-exclusive, and look at green bioethics, which is a principled approach to biomedical ethics rooted in environmental ethics. I just want to recall to your attention that bioethics was initially an ecologically based system. It's from that bios, biology, life ethic. And when it was developed in 1927, coined by Fritz Jahr, bioethics, in 71 by Van Rensselaer Potter, it was really concerned with how we live in society in an ecosystem that sustains us, how we're healthy or unhealthy because of this ecosystem, and how we fit in as part of the bios. Of course, in 1979, the principles of biomedical ethics were codified, and this became the standard. So what happened was essentially bioethics had been developed, but because of the effects of World War II, because of institutionalism, biomedical ethics became the standard. So now that's what we think of, and it's become laconic. And when people say bioethics, they think of principlism. That's not what it was initially. Therefore, environmental bioethics had to be developed as a way to distinguish it. So of course, concepts and terms can have an evolution. That's not a problem. Just to recall, though, that this is not new, putting environment into biomedical ethics. So environmental bioethics, as I noted, has these two separate branches: public health ethics, and then which is the effects of healthcare on the environment, or the effects of the environment on our health, and environmental bioethics, which is essentially the carbon or the resource uses of the healthcare industry. So my critique with this is that although both biomedical ethics and environmental bioethics are helpful lenses to look at carbon reduction, to talk about non-maleficence and not increasing patient risks, it has been largely reactive to climate change. So like a lot of things, climate got out of control, medical industry said, well, we need to do something about it, but it doesn't change. It's just like health issues. It's wait till you get sick and then we'll treat you, not prevention. It's also a bit superficial in that it's looked at these buildings and structures of healthcare, which really is not the heart of healthcare. I think the heart of healthcare is healthcare delivery and services. And that's actually where biomedical ethics and clinical ethics speaks to. So therefore, green bioethics assesses healthcare delivery. So medical developments, techniques, and procedures. And it looks at it from an ecological vantage point. So from this idea of bios, biology, resource consumption, justice, population growth, it says we need to use resources, but we should do it in a way that's balanced and maximizes clinical benefit. It's like being on a budget. You have money, you need to spend it on food and clothing, but you need to figure out where are your values that are going to most sustain your life and be most important, and spend it on that. So green bioethics draws on theory and philosophy from environmental ethics and biomedical ethics. Therefore, it's an interdisciplinary approach to sustainable healthcare practices. And like Beecham and Childress, there are 4 principles. So each of these I will go through in turn, but just an overview is the first one, my priority is for distributive justice. I'm not primarily concerned with carbon emissions or resource use if not everyone has access to it. So first, we need to allocate basic medical resources before we start letting special interest access. And I'll explain what that means. But justice has to be the first thing in biomedicine. Second is we need to conserve our resources. And we can do that one way by providing for healthcare needs before healthcare wants. Third would be simplicity, so reducing dependence on medical interventions. This is preventive health, and then a gradational approach to medical treatments if needed. And then fourth, economics, so looking at why medical decisions proliferate, why they're made. And if it's humanistic reasons instead of financial profit, that's likely more sustainable. So methodologically, principle one is given lexical priority, while the others are intersectional and don't need to be ordered. And this, I think, is also important because it upends Beecham and Childress, and it starts where they left off. So if you remember, justice is the fourth principle, and this, I'm saying, needs to be first, but it needs to be on a global scale. And this, I think, drives a lot of other ethical commitments of environmental ethics, feminist ethics, queer ethics. It's justice. This is what we want to look at, and this should be first. So justice means distributive justice. It downplays respect for autonomy, not in that we would ignore the respect for autonomy, but the respect for autonomy has become a positive right in many places instead of its intention as a negative right. So the idea of respect for autonomy was basically hands off my body. You can't impose medicine on me, but if I need it, I get to guide my medical decision-making. In the United States and other countries, it's become an entitlement. You go to the doctor, you say, I want this procedure. I want this pill. I want this technique. Might not be clinically indicated, but I want it. And if the doctor says it's not clinically indicated, you say, but it's my autonomy, it's my right. Okay, so this says, let's not start first with the entitled, industrialized people who have, by and large, access to homes, shelter, clothing. Let's start with the disadvantaged. Let's start with the women who don't have access to contraception. Let's start with children who are suffering because they have diseases that are easily preventable in other parts of the world, like malaria. Let's start first with people who are suffering because they don't have access to palliative care. So let's start there and see who gets access to medical resources and say it's those people. And those things happen to be also less resource intensive. So if you think of like, what does Doctors Without Borders bring when they travel? It's not reproductive technologies, it's not life support machines, it's vaccines, it's contraception, it's palliative care. It's these things that are going to take care of these basic medical resources. Maybe one day, if we become sustainable, everyone can have access to all of the fetal medical treatments that are non-clinically indicated that they really, really want. But I think for now, in this climate emergency, we need to focus first on getting that level of medical standard of living up first, and then discuss all of the other things that people who already live very well want. And this ties to the second thing. So we need to use resources, but they should be used in a way that all people can access them. So these human needs, I would say, are things that, again, going back to the capabilities, would support capabilities. So things like we need to be able to eat food, to have mobility so that we can get food, to be sheltered, to be warm, to be free from pain. These lead to quality of life and well-being. So it's not standard of living, it's quality of life. A human want, for instance, would be elective shoulder replacement surgery so that you can play golf into your 60s and 70s. Okay, no one wants to be in pain, but the fact that it's elective and the fact that it is linked to something else that's economic and, let's say, luxury emission makes it suspicious. It doesn't mean that the medical industry would never provide for it, but again, go back to the first principle and say, what are we starting from? Someone's shoulder hurts, and so they want it replaced so they can play golf. Or someone has a fistula and she's been ostracized from her community because she's leaking feces, because she's had no attendance for her 7th childbirth. This gives us a picture of the extremes. In the middle, there's a lot, but I really think that we need to highlight the extremes so that we can start at the point of solidarity with others and understand what it means to be just and what is a medical need, and really what's a medical want. Third is simplicity. So this aligns most with environmental ethics. Physicians actually do use the principle of simplicity when they enact therapeutic parsimony or diagnostic elegance. The first one being the idea that you don't overtreat, and the second one being that you think of the most logical or most obvious sources of disease first. So there's an elegance to it. This connects with non-maleficence and that unnecessary medical treatments, over-treatment, over-medicalization can harm patients from infection, medical error, medical death. So this starts with preventive healthcare. First, let's try to make people as healthy as possible by having social structures that mitigate the social determinants of health. Then, if that doesn't work, a gradational approach to healthcare. So for instance, many mental health issues are pharmacological. They've been given pharmaceuticals as the option instead of looking at talk therapy, instead of looking at structures and what other people can do to change their lifestyle to feel better. So just simply prescribing a pill, that's not gradational. That's going to one level and skipping the other lower carbon, less invasive, less medicalized options, for instance. And then fourth, ethical economics. So healthcare should be available to people regardless of ability to pay. Medical procedures should be developed not based on if it's lucrative, because a lot of times highly technological interventions have minimal extra benefit to what we already have, but very high carbon impacts, especially as we rely more on technology and AI. Also thinking that luxury medical goods would be curtailed. So when you looked at the Zika virus outbreak, there weren't enough vaccines because there wasn't a market for it. That's a quote from one of the drug companies. And that meant that people, mostly in parts of the world that were disadvantaged, died from something where they didn't have to. Whereas if you look at line items, for instance, of Viagra, the Department of Defense in the United States spends billions of dollars on it. So again, balancing what are we going to spend our healthcare carbon on? Who gets entitlements to that? Who gets claims on it? And so with these four principles, I think that if we can approach healthcare in this way with the four principles, knowing that some people need much more medical resources, some people are taking too many, which isn't new news. This is everything we've already talked about in medical ethics about allocation and access and justice. This is one of the ways that healthcare can reduce its carbon emissions and be more just and be aligned with biomedical ethics. Of course, every system needs to, all industries need to, all countries need to, but I'm a bioethicist, and so I've been looking at healthcare carbon. And I believe that this is one path forward that can be taught in schools, used as a research framework, and will really be significant in enacting policy on national and international levels as people seek something while we wait for carbon calculations. How do we make ethical medical decisions about healthcare and carbon? That's the first book. And those are some of my references, and that's my contact. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that talk. There's clearly a lot to unpack. I will open it out first to open questions. If anyone's got one, I've got one, but I will open out if anyone's got one first. Okay, everyone's very shy. Oh, Trishanti?
It's not quite a question, more of a reflection. I was interested about the point, the needs versus the want. Is human flourishment not about the want rather than the need? You need to make, so we need to meet the needs in order to achieve human flourishment. And I've always sort of thought that the needs are basic and flourishment is more about the wants. So maybe there needs to be a redefinition of what the wants are. Maybe that is not about owning 100 t-shirts, but maybe that's about something else, being more in tune with nature or something. I think, yeah, do you know what I mean? I think very much flourishment is kind of in the modern society is very much about materialism. That is also part of the problem.
I disagree, because what you said was that it's this connection with nature. So to flourish, it's really non-material. It's love, it's kinship, it's compassion. It's the things that are free. And that's why when you look at sort of economic standards of what you need to live, right, you do need some salary to live in a way that's decent so that your needs are met. But then above that, it's like a law of diminishing returns. So, I mean, I unpack it in one of the chapters of the book on healthcare needs for sure. But there's a point where, again, yeah, we do need to spend resources. We do need to spend carbon. We do need to spend money. But a lot of these wants, these extremes, they increase standard of living, not quality of life. So now people.
I don't disagree. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't disagree. I simply mean that I just wonder if that's a minority view these days. So for a lot of people, a flourishing life is one where they are doing those things that you are saying is not necessary, like playing golf and having elective surgery for that, or flying to the other side of the world for a holiday, staying in a 5-star hotel. Those are kind of things. If you read Oliver James's Affluenza, he talks about not green ethics, but he talks about happiness and you know, and how happiness is impacted on by this focus on materialism. But I just, you know, listening to you, I just wonder, there's something there about green ethics. We are so far behind because our definition of what flourishing life is has evolved over time to one that's not very constructive or productive to the planet or us.
Well, I think for some people it has, but that's also been learned. I mean, 100 years ago, flourishing was not flying to the other side of the world because it wasn't the possibility. And we need to remember that some people, they're not even getting to flourishing. They're not even getting to subsistence. So I think part of our flourishing needs to be compassion and solidarity. And can we really say we're flourishing if I don't care that someone else on another part of the world doesn't have access to basic care? You know.
That's a really good point. How do you actually affect change? Because I can understand obviously the principles in terms of justice, particularly distributive justice, but I find that people who are able to make the decisions aren't necessarily making decisions that would benefit the most people. I mean, hearing things about basic treatment not being treated, for example, not investing in vaccines for Zika virus, whereas Viagra, that's quite stark, but that's driven by profits in companies and pharmaceutical companies that may not have necessarily the bioethic or green ethos.
Yeah, I think it's also driven by heterosexual white men who are making the decisions that Viagra is more important than Zika because it's in their self-interest. Absolutely. So how do we affect change? I think it's a pipeline issue. I think that you need the right people, the ethical people in all places of authority and decision-making, which means that I don't know how to convince them, but they need to get on board with it. And certainly heterosexual white men can be allies, but they need to be pulling the other people up. I think I would take a subsidiary approach that you can do the most good, not the most good, but you can do good where you are. So if you're an educator, educate medical students about it. If you're a policymaker, put it into policy. And all institutions, all people, all levels can do some of this. There's a lot of work being done that medical students want to know about this. They're concerned about climate change and how this affects their health. It's their generation. There's places like the NHS where they are doing work in public health ethics and sustainability. There's United Nations. So there's huge bodies that agree that these things need to get done. Change is slow. I don't think that the change is going to happen in any way that's going to be effective. And that's just simply because of the human condition, I would say. So how do you do it? I don't know. I would love to hear other people, how they're doing it or how they think it can be done. Because other than policy or law, those are, what else can we do?
Mm-hmm.
Anyone, like any of the participants, are you doing this in any of your ways to affect sustainable healthcare, to talk about it, think about it in a way that works?
Well, I guess it's like with most things, it's tiny baby steps, right? So I can say, for example, in my own case, that I asked not to be given an inhaler that works on compressed air, but to have the suck one. It's actually easier to use and it's better on the environment. But when I think about what you've been saying, it would be better for me not to be given an inhaler at all, right? Because it would be better that the environment was improved and that I didn't get the need for it in the first place. I suppose for me, the tricky thing to think through, because I don't have great health, is what you do with the people in the middle when you transition, and that's always a problem, right? And I think you're correct in saying that in biomedical ethics, we're interested, we work in the things that cause doctors concerns, and doctors are very concerned about not treating people, not doing. And I think we can work on that. We can say, well, sometimes doing nothing is better than doing something. But of course, they're already being taught that to some extent through their clinical teaching. But I think having the kind of forgotten transition people would be very difficult for doctors to say, okay, from this point onwards, this is how we're going to do it. We'll leave a lot of people all over the world in poor health while we transition to a greater just and more just resource condition. And I accept completely that I personally will still be a lot better off than many people who are struggling, but not being able to breathe is quite unpleasant.
No, we wouldn't do that. There'd be no reason that we would say, sorry, now you can't breathe, but it's bad for the environment. What we would do, that's a need. Breathing is a need. There would never be, a lot of people don't get anything. There would be a reallocation of the highest carbon, most intensive elective things that don't affect the ability to breathe, sleep, chew, excrete, basic human functions. And so we should have enough carbon that we can do all of this. So society needs to think about, what do we want to give up? We don't want to give up healthcare. Maybe we don't even want to give up elective shoulder replacement surgery, and that's a medical technology, fine. So give up fast fashion, McDonald's, having biological children. Society gets to choose. We have budgets. We understand what it means to choose between two things that we want because we can't afford everything. So that's one thing. Two is that we shouldn't be in this crisis that we're like, would be concerned about green death panels. Of course, it's better to not use medicine for the environment, but the environment isn't the environment's not concerned about us. We're concerned about the environment. I mean, we're part of it and we need to take care of it. But also it's not that, I'm not trying to say that we need to have no people on the earth whatsoever. We are interconnected. So we need to consider, of course, what is our effect on the environment, but that wouldn't trump something like basic healthcare needs. And so I think the transition can happen by first trimming around the edges, the extreme medical treatments that are really elective, that really don't affect somatic health. Then looking at other industries that are unnecessary or decadent, or maybe don't have the same values as science, technology, and progress, even though they're very nice. And like, I do like fashion and good food, but maybe at this point for right now, maybe it's not the wisest use of our carbon, maybe in a few years, and attenuating that. And then shrinking back. I mean, this is just what someone would do with a budget. They look at big items first and then see where we can go little by little, see what substitutions we can make. So for flourishing, can we talk about kinship instead of biological reproduction? Can we talk about no food waste instead of high agriculture meals? What can we do? Humans are very adaptive. We just went through a pandemic where our ideas about flourishing, kinship, love, consumerism, they really change. They can change again. The problem with the environmental problem is that it's statistical, not identifiable victims. Whereas with COVID, we saw grandparents, friends, family dying of the virus, and we really said we need to act. And it affected us personally. The climate issue doesn't necessarily, it's like never affected me, for instance, because I've been privileged to be in very wealthy areas where I've had the health and ability to move and not been affected by a climate disaster. So that's how it is for the people that are most responsible for it. You don't see the damage, but you cause it. Yeah.
What I'm worried about, as of today, the report came out how much money the fossil fuel companies are making. Yeah, specifically BP today. Shell in 2 days' time will release their figures, and Total in France will be releasing the figures next week. So if you put all three together, they're making, I think, was it 10 billion pound profits, and paying very little in back to the country, because they have ways of getting around the tax rules, and more profits. Those profits equate to 3 times. I think we go. They are actually extracting 8 to 10 years worth of fossils out of the ground at the moment. The rate of production. So even if they stopped, we would have fossils to keep us going for at least 10 years, burning CO2. Yeah. So I think it's a crazy system where these guys are allowed to obviously get on with their work, which ethically is wrong, I think, and bioethically is definitely wrong from what you're saying. Yeah. So these are people who are polluting the environment for my grandchildren, who will actually have heat extremes, flooding, and everything you talked about, food shortages, and all the bits we just got from the United Nations planetary report that I just mentioned. So it's all there. It's all in writing. It's just people waking up to actually get into action. We've got the radical people, like the ones who glue themselves to the road. I don't personally think that's the way to go forwards, but that just antagonizes people who want to get to work and find they can't get there. Yeah, but that's up to everybody to do their own action, and they are showing that they do want action, direct action, but perhaps not. But we can all do little things. I'm working for we've got a working group with the University of the 3As, which is University of the Third Age, which I belong to, because I'm that sort of age, vintage, and it takes vintage people over the age of 65. And we have just finished a 10-week 1-hour module on climate change. Not a lot, but what we've been out of that, people are interested, and we're just going to meet up and come ideas to the group. So I am looking at finding financial advisors who can actually buy shares for me for my pension, which are as green as we can make them. We haven't found anybody yet, but I'm sure they exist somewhere. But you know, if you look at any average share, go and look at your pension fund. If you're going to access comfort, go and have a look at your pension fund. Okay, find out who's putting where your pension is, because you're young, so you got at least 30 years worth of pension going into a fund, and I bet you it'll be BP, Shell, and then BAT, which is British Tobacco, and Imperial, which are the 2 British tobacco companies. Yeah, and in America there'll be different companies, but so it'll be tobacco and smoking, and tobacco basically is a different healthcare issue. But there we are. I've said enough. I'm going to mute myself.
Sorry, what are the universities though? You mentioned 3, I think. I didn't get that.
Sorry, it's just called UA3, founded in, I think, France about 40 years ago. The United University of the Third Age. And I go to U3AC, which is University of Third Age, Cambridge. That's about 50, and they do prospectus that thick, and they do Spanish, Italian, whatever, history, Renaissance, and so I picked climate change, and I was late applicant, so there was very little left. So the pickings were climate change, brain development, which was quite interesting, and astronomy. So we looked at that, but it was full of stars, full of brains, and full of climate change. So So there we go. University of the Third Age, and then I think different universities do modules. So Cambridge is the nearest to me, and it's just picking up where keep your brain ticking, really.
Cristina, I've got a few comments in the chat. I don't know if you've seen them. So
Could you read them out to me?
Yeah, I think one way is to look at behavioral change and public principles such as nudge theory. Another one, it says, thanks, Cristina, very interesting talk and very important topic. I've included green ethics in my module this year and students are really engaged. analysis, there is the Planetary Health Report Card, an international initiative that pushes for planetary health in medical and healthcare curriculum. And now most medical schools have some planetary health and sustainability in the curricula. Yeah, in Kieran, we are a very long way from truly sustainable alternative fuel for transport. E-cars still mainly rely on fossil fuels.
All very good points.
Perfect. If there isn't any more questions, any last minute questions, I think we'll round up. Any going?
I think e-cars are a bit of a digression to keep the fossil fuel companies going, I think, for a while, but because they're going to produce heavy metals, which I personally don't know how we're going to get rid of in 8-10 years time. But they keep saying we'll discover that technology when the problem arises, but it's going to be a big problem. Already the North Pole, which is Arctic, is being diluted with the what do you call it? They're producing heavy metals from there because the glaciers are receding. Anyway.
Well, I'd like to thank you publicly again, Cristina. Thank you so much for speaking today and sharing your time, particularly as you just came off of leave and you've managed to fit us in as well. We will disseminate, I think at your request also, some of the lecture slides,
Sure.
As well as a recording, because I know quite a few people wanted to watch but weren't able to attend.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate your commitment to sustainability, and I hope that this is material that you can use in other courses and influence other people too, so we can get that change.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.